a night out, and a missing phone. Number 5. Last night, a friend rushed me out of the house so we could catch the opening act at a local bar's music night. It was one of those nights that started out normal. Loud music, crowded tables, dim lights flickering against the walls. We had a few drinks, chatted about meaningless things, and laughed at the off-key band playing in the corner. At some point in the night, I reached into my pocket to check my phone, only to realize it wasn't there. My heart sank. I quickly scanned the table, thinking I might have set it down while reaching for my drink. Nothing. I retraced my steps, checked the bar counter, the bathroom, even the little space between the cushions of the booth we were sitting at. Still nothing. Panic started creeping in. I borrowed my friend's phone and dialed my number, hoping to hear it vibrate somewhere nearby. After 2 rings, someone answered. At first, there was nothing but heavy breathing on the line, deep and ragged. Then, a slow, rasping giggle, low and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. The call ended abruptly. I stared at the phone, my fingers suddenly cold. My friend asked me what happened, but I couldn't explain it. I called again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. Whoever had my phone wasn't answering anymore. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that maybe someone had just found it and was messing with me, but a feeling of unease lingered for the rest of the night. Eventually, I gave up searching. Frustrated, I left the bar and headed home, already thinking about how I'd have to replace my phone. But when I stepped into my bedroom, my stomach dropped. My phone was there, sitting perfectly on my nightstand, right where I had left it before I even went out. Then, a new notification lit up the screen, a recent call from my own number. Number 4. When I was a kid, I was always the last one picked up by the school bus. I lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, and most of the other kids lived closer to the school. One morning, I stood at my usual spot, kicking pebbles on the pavement while waiting. It was colder than usual, and the street was eerily silent, as if the world hadn't woken up yet. Then a bus pulled up. It looked like the usual school bus, same yellow paint, same number on the side, but something felt off. The bus was completely empty. No kids, no chatter, just the driver smiling at me through the windshield. I hesitated. The door creaked open, and the driver, an older man with deep wrinkles and a thin mustache, leaned slightly toward me. "Hop on," he said cheerfully. I hesitated again. "Where are the other kids?" The man's smile twitched slightly. "We'll pick them up now. Just get on, kid." Something in my gut screamed at me to say no. His smile never wavered, but there was something forced about it, something hungry. I shook my head. "I think I'll wait for the real bus." His eyes darkened. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles turning white. For a moment, he just sat there, watching me, as if debating something. Then, without another word, he pulled the lever, shut the doors, and drove off. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. 2 minutes later, my real school bus arrived, filled with kids. That night, I casually mentioned the strange bus to my parents. Their reactions were anything but casual. My dad immediately picked up the phone, calling the school, the bus company, anyone who might know about an unscheduled bus route. But there was no record of another bus coming through that morning. No substitute drivers. No empty bus sent to pick up students. Nothing. To this day, I still wonder, what would have happened if I had stepped on that bus? Number 3. A few years ago, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. It was newly renovated, freshly painted, and in a quiet building, perfect for me. Or so I thought. The problem was my neighbor. She was a middle-aged woman, maybe in her late 40s, but she looked much older. Her face was sunken, her skin pale and dry like cracked leather. At first, she seemed harmless, just another eccentric tenant. But at night, I'd hear her. She'd stay up until the early hours, listening to Christian radio broadcasts at full volume, Sometimes she'd talk loudly to someone in her apartment. Only as far as I could tell, she lived alone. One night, I decided to ask her to keep it down. I knocked on her door. After a few moments, it creaked open just a few inches. I caught a glimpse inside. The walls were covered in crosses, all painted in different colors, some upright, some upside down. Words like Jesus and angels were scribbled everywhere. The windows were blacked out, letting in no light. The air was thick, damp, and stank of decay. And then I noticed something else. The floor was covered in cockroaches. She stared at me, unblinking, her pupils impossibly large. "Can you turn it down a little?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly closed the door in my face. The radio got louder. That night, I had my girlfriend over. We fell asleep after a movie, but sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up feeling watched. I turned my head slightly and saw her, standing at the edge of my bed. A shadowy figure, barely illuminated by the streetlights outside. At first, I thought I was hallucinating one of those weird, half-awake dreams. Then she spoke. "You should lock your doors at night." Her voice was low, almost sing-song. I shot up, heart pounding, but before I could react, she turned and walked out of my apartment. The door clicked shut behind her. The next morning, I told the building manager everything. He paled and told me he'd had similar complaints before. The last tenant in my apartment had also found her inside, standing behind his couch watching him with a power drill in her hand. I called the cops. They already knew about her. She was a violent schizophrenic who refused to take her meds, but because she owned her apartment, they couldn't force her to leave. I spent the next 2 days awake, waiting. Finally, at 2 a.m., I heard her leave for a cigarette run. I called the cops immediately. They arrived in minutes, 3 patrol cars and a special van. They tackled her to the ground and dragged her away. I never saw her again. But sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night feeling watched. And I wonder, was she really the only one living in that apartment? Number 2. It was my last break before the end of my night shift. Just 30 more minutes and I could go home. I worked in an industrial district where everything shut down after dark, leaving the streets eerily empty. The silence was so thick you could hear your own heartbeat. Then a sudden crash. The sharp, shattering sound of glass breaking echoed through the office. My pulse spiked. I jumped up, scanning the room before cautiously making my way toward the noise. One of the front windows had been completely shattered. A large rock, about the size of a grapefruit, lay among the shards of glass. I froze. No one was outside, no footsteps running away, no voices, nothing. This wasn't some random act of vandalism. It was deliberate, and I was the only one in the building. I quickly called security, reporting the incident in a hushed, shaky voice. They assured me they'd send someone to check it out, but I wasn't about to stick around. I grabbed my things, turned off the lights, and left the office in a hurry. The further I got from the building, the worse the feeling in my gut became. The unease wrapped around my ribs like a tightening vice. I tried to shake it off, but as I approached my car, a terrifying realization hit me. I never unlocked my car. It had been unlocked the entire time. Panic surged through me as I yanked the door open and jumped in. My breathing was rapid, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the locks. Then something even worse crossed my mind. What if someone was already inside? With my heart hammering, I reached back, running my hand over the seats, half expecting to feel someone's cold fingers grabbing mine. But nothing. I let out a shaky breath and started the car, speeding out of the lot, wanting to put as much distance between me and that building as possible. For a while, I calmed down. The bright streetlights of the city made me feel safe again. I even called a friend who told me he was out drinking and invited me to join him. By then, the fear had faded. I figured I just needed a drink. I decided to take my bike instead of my car, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. The ride was peaceful at first. The streets were quiet, the moon was bright, and for the first time that night, I felt a little bit at ease. Then I heard it. The sound of tires rolling softly behind me. Someone else was riding a bike, keeping pace with me. I straightened up, moving slightly to the side, expecting them to pass. They did. And as they did, they turned to look at me. The man's face was lit by the moonlight. His features twisted into a grin that was anything but friendly. His eyes were wide, unblinking. It was the kind of smile you see in your worst nightmares. That's when I noticed the bike he was riding. It was my mother's. I slammed on the brakes, my blood running ice cold. The man kept riding, vanishing into the dark. I sprinted home, my lungs burning. When I got there, I found the front door slightly ajar. My mother's bike was missing from the garage, and worse, one of my car doors, the back left one, was wide open. The same door I hadn't touched? Night Shift Chronicles: A Guard's Tale. Number 1. I used to work the night shift at a campground, 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. It was an easy job. Most nights I'd bring my PS2, play games, and only have to deal with the occasional late-night camper. The only company I had was the endless darkness surrounding the tiny 888 guard shack I worked in. During my first week on the job, the guy I was replacing gave me a warning. "There's a payphone just a few feet from this shack," he said, pointing toward the dimly lit phone booth near the entrance. "It rings every night at exactly 4:17 a.m., just once." I frowned. "Who calls it?" He shrugged. "Dunno. Probably just an automated test call. I've never answered it." That should have been the end of it. For months, I worked my shifts without paying much attention to the phone. I usually kept the windows closed, so I never even heard it ring. Then in mid-August, I started leaving the windows open to let in the cool night air. And sure enough, at exactly 4:17 a.m., the payphone rang. It was a single, drawn-out ring. But it sounded wrong, like it was submerged in water. Something about it sent a chill down my spine. At first, I ignored it, but curiosity gnawed at me. One night, I set an alarm for 4:15 a.m. and went to the payphone. I stood there watching it. 17 a.m. The phone rang. I answered it. Silence. I could hear breathing, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. This went on for a week, each night the same thing. One ring, then dead silence. Eventually, I gave up. For about a month, I ignored the phone calls. Then, in the first week of October, my curiosity got the better of me again. I set my alarm. 17 a.m. The phone rang. I picked it up. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard it. A long, slow inhale through clenched teeth. The breath rattled like broken glass. Then came the voice, low, gravelly, like someone had been gargling rocks. And it said my name, my full name. First, middle, last. I felt my throat close up. My entire body went cold. The voice was completely unfamiliar. I had never heard it before in my life. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking violently. I needed to know where the call was coming from. Desperate, I fumbled for some change, dropped it into the slot, and hit. The automated voice crackled through the speaker. The last call was received from... A pause. Then a location. California. But I was in Indiana. There was no reason, no possible way, for someone in California to know my full name and call a forgotten payphone in the middle of nowhere. I never answered that phone again. But every night at 4:17 a.m., I still heard it ring. Just once, and I never ever checked to see if someone was standing by the booth.